She's with me. 3 words. Calm, certain, unmovable. She had been trying to free herself from her ex's grip for minutes that felt like hours, when a stranger simply stepped forward and changed everything. No drama, no performance, just a quiet kind of courage that stopped the whole hallway. And when she turned to look at him, really look at him, the glance she gave wasn't gratitude. It was something far more dangerous than that. If you've ever wished someone would show up at exactly the right moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. This story is just getting started, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The Celeste restaurant occupied the kind of space that made people straighten their posture the moment they walked through the door. Located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, it wore its reputation quietly. No neon signs, no loud branding, just a discreet brass plate beside a dark wooden door that had been polished every morning for 11 years. Inside, the lighting was warm and deliberate, the kind that made everyone look like they had secrets worth keeping. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Conversations were low, measured, performed. April Sinclair had eaten here 14 times. She knew the maitre d' by name. She knew which table had the best acoustics for a negotiation and which corner allowed a private breakdown without witnesses. Tonight, she had chosen the latter, not for business, but because her best friend had cancelled at the last minute, and April had refused to go back to her Tribeca penthouse before 10. Going home early felt like surrender, and April Sinclair did not surrender. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress that skimmed her figure without announcing it, the kind of choice that said I dressed for myself and meant it. Her dark hair was pulled back at the neck, a few strands loose, and her heels added exactly 3 inches to a presence that didn't need them. She moved through the restaurant the way she moved through boardrooms, like she had already calculated every exit. She was heading toward the restroom when she saw him. Marcus. He was standing in the narrow corridor between the private dining rooms, a glass of Bordeaux in one hand, and a smile that had never once been warm, despite years of practice. He had the jawline of a man who had been photographed often and knew it. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit too well, the kind of man who understood that appearance was leverage. April. His voice landed like a hand on her shoulder she hadn't agreed to. She stopped, not out of fear. She had been afraid of Marcus once, and she had spent 2 years dismantling that particular habit. She stopped because the corridor was narrow, and he had already positioned himself to occupy most of it. Marcus, she kept her voice even. I didn't know you were here tonight. Of course you didn't. He stepped closer. Not aggressively. He never did anything aggressively in public. It was always subtle with Marcus. The adjusted angle, the lowered voice, the way he made small spaces feel smaller. You look incredible, by the way. You always look incredible when you're trying not to be noticed. I'm not trying to be anything. She held his gaze. And I'm heading somewhere. You're always heading somewhere. He tilted his head, and the smile shifted into something that didn't have a clean name. That was always the problem, wasn't it? You were always moving, never quite present. April felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not pain, not fear, but something older. The memory of standing in his apartment while he rearranged her sentences until she couldn't remember what she'd originally meant to say. She had been 28 then. She was 36 now and considerably less interested in being rearranged. Excuse me, she said, stepping to the right. He stepped with her. It was such a small movement. Anyone watching would have seen nothing. That was the architecture of it, always invisible from the outside, always suffocating from within. I've been thinking, Marcus continued, swirling his glass lightly, that we should have a conversation, a real one. There are things I should have. She's with me. The voice came from the left, low, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. April turned. The man standing beside her was not from this world. Not the world of Celeste restaurant. Not the world of Bordeaux and tailored charcoal suits and calculated smiles. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that suggested the formality had been added recently, like a last-minute concession to the dress code. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. There was a callus along the right palm. He wasn't wearing a watch. He was looking at Marcus. not with hostility. That was what made it so disorienting. There was no threat in his expression, no performance of dominance. There was simply a calm that felt geological, like something formed over centuries under tremendous pressure and entirely unmoved by the temperature of a room. His eyes were dark, steady, and they rested on Marcus the way a mountain rests on the ground beneath it, without effort, without apology, without the slightest interest in being challenged. Marcus blinked. Just once. But April caught it. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the Polish on his voice thinning slightly. "And you are?" The man didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do its work. Then, unhurried, "Someone who's been waiting for her." 3 seconds passed. Marcus looked between them, recalibrating, reassembling the smile that had slipped a quarter inch. "Right," he said finally. "Well." He lifted his glass in something that wanted to be gracious and wasn't quite. "April." And then he walked away. April stood very still in the corridor. The man beside her didn't speak. He wasn't looking at her yet. His gaze had followed Marcus until Marcus had disappeared around the corner, the way someone checks that a door is actually closed before turning back to the room. Then he looked at her, and she looked at him. It lasted longer than it should have. Not because either of them planned it. She could tell he hadn't planned any of this, which was precisely the part she couldn't locate a response to. He had no angle, no follow-through. His expression held nothing she could identify as calculation, just a kind of quiet attentiveness, like someone listening to a piece of music they hadn't heard before and weren't sure yet what to make of it. April Sinclair had been looked at by powerful men her entire adult life. She knew every variation of that look: desire dressed as admiration, ambition dressed as interest, possession dressed as care. She had a taxonomy for all of it. This didn't fit anywhere in the taxonomy. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He nodded once. "You had it handled." "I did," she said. And then, because something in her was still calibrating, "But it was faster with help." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that preceded one. He stepped back, giving her the corridor, and April walked toward the restroom with her pulse doing something entirely unprofessional, and the unsettling certainty that she had just been seen, not by someone who wanted something from her, but simply by someone who had been paying attention. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why that felt like the beginning of something. Carter's garage sat on a corner in Red Hook, Brooklyn, like it had never considered moving. No sleek signage, no digital display, no attempt to be anything other than exactly what it was. A working garage with oil-stained concrete floors, the permanent smell of metal and grease embedded in every surface, and the kind of organized chaos that only made sense to the person who had built it. The roll-up door was open to the Saturday morning air, and the sound of something classic playing low on a Bluetooth speaker drifted out onto the sidewalk, like an invitation that wasn't trying too hard. April sat in her car across the street for 4 minutes before she got out. She had told herself 3 different stories about why she was here. The first involved research. She was considering investing in independent auto businesses as part of a portfolio diversification, which was technically true and entirely irrelevant. The second involved closure. She simply wanted to thank him properly, which was the kind of thing a person with good manners did, which she was. The third story she didn't examine too closely, because it involved the way she had lain awake at 1 a.m. Thursday, and again at 3 a.m. Friday, not anxious, not stressed, just awake, with the particular quality of wakefulness that felt like waiting for something she couldn't name. She was wearing dark fitted trousers and a camel-colored blazer over a white shirt, the top button open. Not business, not casual. The deliberate in-between of someone who had spent more time getting dressed than she intended to admit. The garage held 2 motorcycles in various states of assembly, a truck with its hood open, and 1 pair of boots visible beneath a Harley-Davidson that was suspended on a low platform. Classic, black, the kind of machine that looked like it had a history. April stepped inside. The music shifted, something with a steady, unhurried rhythm, like the garage itself had a pulse. She stopped a few feet from the Harley and waited, because she had learned long ago that walking into someone else's space and immediately filling it with noise was a form of bad manners that boardrooms had mistakenly classified as confidence. The boots moved. There was the sound of something being set down, a wrench by the weight of it, and then Alexander Carter slid out from beneath the motorcycle with the unhurried ease of someone completely at home in their own skin. He sat up, saw her, and for one unguarded moment his expression did something that he didn't have time to edit. A brief, unperformed surprise, followed by something quieter that settled in his eyes and stayed there. He reached for a cloth tucked into his back pocket and wiped his hands. He didn't scramble to his feet immediately. He took a breath. He stood the way people stand when they're not performing standing. "You found it," he said. "I have GPS," she said, "and a driver who looked slightly concerned when I gave him the address. Red Hook tends to do that to drivers from Tribeca." She looked at him. In the daylight, away from the muted gold of Celeste's corridor lighting, he was different, not less, but more specific. The lines of his face were unhurried, the jaw slightly shadowed, the dark eyes holding that same quality of attention she remembered and had been unable to stop thinking about since. He was wearing a worn grey t-shirt and work jeans, and he looked entirely infuriatingly comfortable. "I came to thank you properly," she said. "Thursday night. You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed, "I didn't." There was no but attached, no angle being set up, just the clean acknowledgement of a choice he'd made without requiring her to validate it. April tilted her head slightly. Most people follow that with something. An explanation. A justification. Most people feel like they need one. He glanced briefly at the Harley, then back at her. "You want coffee? I've got a pot that's been sitting for about 20 minutes, so it's either perfect or a crime against caffeine, depending on your standards." She should have said no. She had a call at noon and 3 emails that qualified as urgent by any reasonable definition. She had a board member who'd been attempting to reach her since Thursday with the particular persistence of someone who wanted to renegotiate something she had already decided. "Sure," she said. The small office at the back of the garage was unexpectedly human. A desk buried under invoices and mechanical manuals, a shelf with 3 framed photographs she didn't examine closely enough to identify, a coffee maker that had clearly been used with devotion. He poured 2 mugs without asking how she took it, then raised an eyebrow. "Black," she said. Something in his expression registered approval he didn't vocalize. They stood on either side of the desk because there was only one chair and neither of them moved toward it, which created a particular geometry. Close enough for a real conversation, far enough for the pretense of formality. "You always work Saturdays?" she asked. "When there's something worth working on?" He nodded toward the Harley through the doorway. "She belonged to my father. I've been rebuilding her for about 8 months. 8 months for one motorcycle. She deserves it." He said it simply, without sentimentality, but with a weight that made the sentence mean more than its words. "Some things are worth taking your time with." April felt the sentence land somewhere slightly below her sternum. She took a sip of coffee. It was, in fact, perfect, and looked at him over the rim of the mug. "I don't do this," she said. "Do what?" "Show up somewhere without a reason that holds up under scrutiny." He considered that, not rushing to fill the space, not offering her an easier interpretation, just letting it exist between them, which was simultaneously the most uncomfortable and most honest thing anyone had done in her presence in recent memory. "And does it?" he asked finally. "Hold up under scrutiny." April set the mug down on the edge of the desk. Outside, a car passed, and the Saturday morning light moved across the garage floor in a slow, unhurried stripe. "I haven't decided yet," she said. She left 12 minutes later. And for the entire drive back across the bridge, she could still detect, faintly, persistently, impossibly, the smell of motor oil and something warm underneath it, settled into the fabric of her blazer, like it had always been there, waiting for exactly this moment to make itself known. The cafe had no business being that good. It occupied a narrow space at the edge of Brooklyn Bridge Park, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Regulars found it the way people find anything worth finding, by accident, and then repeatedly on purpose. The windows faced the East River, and on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, the water was doing that particular thing it did in autumn, catching the low light and holding it like it was in no hurry to let go. The Manhattan skyline rose across the water, sharp and certain, and from this side of the river, it looked exactly like what it was, a place that had decided long ago that it was the center of everything. April had been given the wrong address. Her assistant had typed Pier 1 when the client meeting was at Pier 17, and by the time April had identified the discrepancy, her driver was already merging onto the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and turning back would cost 40 minutes she didn't have. She had rescheduled the meeting with 3 words, something came up, and stood on the waterfront in her charcoal wool coat, feeling the particular frustration of a perfectly structured day developing a crack. Then she had smelled the coffee. She was sitting at a window table with her laptop open and a cortado she hadn't planned on ordering when the door opened and Alexander walked in. He saw her at the exact same moment she saw him. The pause lasted 1 breath. His expression did that thing again. The unedited version, before whatever filter most people applied had time to engage. Genuine surprise. And then, following it so closely, it was almost part of the same motion, something that looked a great deal like quiet satisfaction. He was wearing a dark jacket over a simple shirt, dark jeans, and he carried himself through the cafe the way he moved through the garage, like someone who had decided long ago that a room didn't require his performance. "Wrong address?" he said, stopping beside her table. "Remarkably specific guess. You're not a Wednesday afternoon waterfront person." He glanced at her laptop, her posture, the cortado. "You're a conference room person who ended up here by accident and decided to make it work." April studied him for a moment. "And you? Right address?" "I live 4 blocks from here. This is my Wednesday afternoon." He nodded toward the counter. "I'll get my coffee and let you work." "You don't have to—" She stopped, started again. "You can sit down if you want." He did. What followed was not what April would have predicted. She had expected the careful performance of 2 people still figuring out the rules, the managed conversation, the deliberate charm, the architecture of a first real meeting dressed as coincidence. What she got instead was an argument about infrastructure. It began with Alexander noticing the report open on her screen, a city development proposal for a waterfront district in Lower Manhattan, and making a comment about load-bearing assumptions that was technically outside his lane and entirely correct. April told him so, the second part first. He raised an eyebrow. She explained the structural flaw in his reasoning. He disagreed specifically and without apology. She pushed back. He didn't move. "I think because you finance 3 waterfront developments, you understand how they're actually built," he said. "I think because I've financed 3 waterfront developments, I understand what makes them viable." Viable and built are 2 different conversations. Not when you're the one deciding whether they happen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts challenge and something warmer, something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "You always lead with the money? The money is what makes everything else possible. The money is what makes the version that gets approved possible," he said, "which is not always the same thing as the version that should exist." April opened her mouth, closed it. The distinction was inconveniently valid. "You've thought about this," she said. "I build things. I think about what they're actually made of." Outside, a tugboat moved across the river, slow and purposeful. The cafe had filled slightly around them, a young couple by the door, a man with headphones, 2 women sharing something on a phone. But their table had developed its own atmosphere, separate from the room, pressurized in a specific and not unpleasant way. They disagreed about 3 more things in the next 40 minutes: urban green space allocation, the relationship between aesthetic design and structural integrity, whether a building could have a soul, which April said was not a useful variable, and Alexander said was the only one that mattered. "That's not something you can put in a proposal," she said. "No," he said, "but you know it when it's missing." April looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something generous to the angles of his face, and she was aware, had been aware for the last 20 minutes with increasing inconvenience, of the exact distance between her hand on the table and his, resting near his coffee cup with the easy stillness of hands that knew how to be patient. She looked back at her screen, and then it happened. The laugh. It arrived without warning, without cause she could immediately identify, sparked by something he said about a particularly catastrophic city planning decision involving a bike lane and a structural column, delivered with such dry precision that her body simply responded before her composure had time to intercept it. Not the measured smile she gave in interviews, not the polished chuckle of a woman who knew she was being watched. A real laugh, sudden, unguarded, briefly uncontrollable, the kind that left a silence afterward that felt clean and slightly dangerous. Alexander went still, not uncomfortably, just still, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully translate, something careful and open at the same time, like someone witnessing something they hadn't expected and weren't sure they deserved to see. April pressed her lips together, looked out at the river. "That doesn't happen often," she said, not quite to him. "I know," he said quietly. And the fact that he said "I know" instead of "I'm glad" or "you should do that more," the fact that he simply acknowledged it without trying to own it or reproduce it, settled somewhere in April's chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't realized was there. She closed her laptop at 4:47 p.m. She had meant to leave at 3. The visits had no official name. That was the first thing April noticed. The absence of a category for what she was doing. In her life, everything had a category. Meetings had agendas, calls had objectives. Even her rare social engagements had a function, a context, a reason that could withstand a calendar audit. But showing up at Carter's garage on a Tuesday morning with 2 coffees and no explanation that would survive professional scrutiny, that didn't fit anywhere in the existing architecture of her days. She came anyway. The second time, she brought the coffees and a question about the Harley's engine rebuild that she had researched the night before specifically so the visit would have a pretext. Alexander had accepted the coffee, answered the question without making her feel the pretext was visible, and then handed her a wrench and asked her to hold a specific component in place while he worked. She had held it for 20 minutes without complaint. Her manicure had not survived. She had not mentioned it. The third time she didn't bring a question. He didn't ask for one. By the 4th visit, there was a second stool near the workbench that hadn't been there before. Neither of them acknowledged it. She sat on it and read through briefs on her phone while he worked, and the silence between them was the specific kind that didn't ask anything of either person. Comfortable in a way that April, who had spent years in rooms full of people she couldn't fully relax around, found quietly astonishing. It was on a Thursday night that everything shifted. April was in her Tribeca penthouse at 1:47 a.m. When the notification arrived, not the routine kind, not the manageable kind, but the particular category of corporate crisis that had its own specific gravity. A board member had leaked preliminary acquisition figures to a financial journalist. The story was running at 6 a.m. The numbers were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough to move markets in a direction that would require 3 days of careful, visible damage control, and the leak itself created a secondary problem that was in some ways worse than the first. April sat at her kitchen island, white marble, city lights visible through floor-to-ceiling glass, the penthouse quiet in the way expensive spaces are quiet, which is to say thoroughly and artificially, and opened her contacts. She scrolled past her lead attorney, past her COO, past the board chair whose number she had memorized and dialed in the dark more times than she could count. Her thumb moved through the list with the purposeful automation of someone who had done this before, who knew the hierarchy of calls, who understood the chain. It stopped on Alexander's name. She stared at it for a moment. Then she pressed call. It rang twice. His voice arrived on the 3rd ring, low, slightly roughened by sleep, unhurried even at 1:47 in the morning, like waking up to an unscheduled call was simply another thing that happened, and he had decided in advance to meet it without alarm. "Hey," he said. "Just that. Not is everything okay, or do you know what time it is, or any of the things the situation technically warranted. Just her name, acknowledged, in a voice that made space." April exhaled, and then she talked. She talked about the leak and the journalist and the numbers, and the board member whose identity she already knew with 90% certainty. She talked about the 6 a.m. window and the market implications and the secondary problem that lived underneath the first one. She talked with the velocity and precision of someone who spent her professional life translating complex situations into actionable language, and Alexander listened without interrupting, without offering solutions she hadn't asked for, without the particular kind of male helpfulness that dressed itself as support, but was mostly the need to be useful. He just listened. When she finished, the silence lasted 4 seconds. Then he said, "The board member who leaked, is this the first time or the first time it's gotten out?" April paused. "Second time. Different information. Same direction." "Then the leak isn't the problem. The leak is the symptom." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "You already knew that?" "Yes." "So what do you actually need at 2 a.m.? The question was so direct and so absent of judgment that April felt something in her chest shift sideways. What did she actually need? Not strategy, she had that. Not legal counsel, she had that too. Not reassurance, which she had trained herself not to require. "I needed to say it out loud," she said finally, "to someone who wasn't inside the building." "Okay," he said, simply, like that was a completely reasonable thing to need, and he was glad she'd called. They stayed on the line for another 11 minutes. He didn't fill the time with advice or analysis. He asked 2 more questions, both precise, both useful, and mostly remained present in the particular way that presence can be felt even through a phone at 2 a.m. When they hung up, April set her phone face down on the marble counter and sat in the silence of her penthouse for a long time. She had not called her attorney. She had not called her COO. She had not called the board chair. She had called a man who rebuilt motorcycles in Red Hook and asked none of the right questions, and somehow that had been exactly what the situation required. The next morning, after 3 hours of sleep and 4 hours of precise, effective damage control that her team executed without a single visible error, April drove to Brooklyn. She didn't call ahead. She walked into the garage at 11 a.m. And Alexander looked up from the Harley, and something moved across his face. Not surprise this time, and not the quiet satisfaction of the cafe. Something more deliberate, more considered. The expression of a man who had spent the previous night understanding something and had decided by morning what to do with it. He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then he reached for the second stool, moved it slightly closer to the workbench, and said, "Coffee's fresh." He didn't mention the call. He didn't need to. The fact that the stool had moved just 6 inches, just enough, said everything neither of them was ready to put into words yet, hanging in the air between them like a question the garage itself was holding its breath to hear answered. Alexander had described it as the real Brooklyn. April had interpreted this as a mild provocation, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to imply that your version of a place was somehow less legitimate than theirs. She had been to Brooklyn. She had attended gallery openings in Dumbo, a fundraiser in Park Slope, a dinner in Cobble Hill that had been written up in 3 separate lifestyle publications. She knew Brooklyn. She did not, it turned out, know this Brooklyn. They met at the garage at 7 on a Friday evening, which meant Alexander had closed up early. Something she only understood was significant when she saw the rolled-down door and the padlock, and realized that Carter's garage did not typically close before 9 on a Friday. He was waiting outside in a dark jacket, no tie, the kind of effortless put-together that had nothing to do with effort. He looked at her. Camel coat, dark jeans, ankle boots with a heel that added confidence to a stride that didn't need it, and said nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. They walked. Not toward anything April could identify on a map, but through streets that had their own logic, past a mural that covered an entire building in colors that had no business being that vivid in October, past a corner store where Alexander exchanged a few words with the owner in the easy shorthand of people who had been neighbors for years, past a small park where 2 men were playing chess under a single working streetlight with the focused solemnity of a professional match. "You grew up here," April said. It wasn't a question. Red Hook specifically, my father had the garage, his father had it before him. He said it without nostalgia, just fact, but the kind of fact that had weight. Third generation. And you never wanted to leave? He glanced at her sideways. Did you always want to stay? April considered that. She had come to Manhattan at 22 with a business degree, $40,000 in student debt, and a specific and non-negotiable intention to build something that couldn't be taken from her. Staying had never been the word for it. Staying implied passivity. She had planted. That's different, she said. Is it? The bar had no name visible from the street, just a door, dark wood, a small amber light above it that you would miss if you weren't looking. Inside it was narrow and warm, with exposed brick walls and a bartender who nodded at Alexander like he was expected. The music was something with a trumpet and a bass line that moved through the floorboards rather than the air. The lighting was the color of late evening. April had been to bars that cost 4 times as much to look half as good as this. They found a standing spot near the far end of the bar, close enough to talk without raising their voices, far enough from the speakers that the music remained an atmosphere rather than an obstacle. Alexander ordered without consulting a menu, whiskey neat and a glass of something for her that arrived moments later and turned out to be exactly right, which she did not comment on because commenting on it would require acknowledging that he had paid attention to what she'd ordered at the cafe 2 weeks ago. She had paid attention too. They talked, not about work, not about her work, or his work, or the intersection of their 2 entirely different worlds. They talked about the city itself, about what it had been and what it was becoming, and whether those were 2 parts of the same story or 2 separate ones. Alexander had opinions that were specific and unsentimental and occasionally uncomfortable, and April disagreed with approximately half of them and found herself genuinely energized by the disagreement in a way that board meetings, despite their stated purpose, rarely produced. At some point, she couldn't mark exactly when, the bar had filled further and the space around them had compressed naturally, the way crowded rooms do, bodies redistributing to accommodate new arrivals. She was aware of it peripherally, the way you're aware of weather changing, until the man behind her shifted and she stepped forward automatically, and the distance between her and Alexander went from conversational to something that didn't have a professional category. She started to step back. A gust of cold air swept through as someone opened the street door, and the involuntary shiver that moved through her body carried her forward instead, just a small, unplanned movement, barely an inch, but enough that she reached out instinctively for balance and her hand found the lapel of his jacket. His hands found her waist. It was a reflex. She knew it was a reflex, the automatic steadying of someone who had seen her pitch forward and responded before thought had time to supervise instinct, but the reflex didn't correct and withdraw. His hands stayed, one on each side, light but definite, and she was standing close enough now to be aware of the warmth that came off him and the specific quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone making a conscious decision not to move. 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. April looked up. He was already looking at her, not with the calculating assessment she knew how to navigate, not with the performed desire that had always felt like a transaction, but with something open and careful and entirely undefended, like a man who had decided that honesty was the only currency he knew how to spend. Neither of them spoke. The trumpet in the music landed on a long-held note that seemed to understand the room. Then someone laughed loudly near the door, and the spell didn't break so much as expand, becoming something both of them were now standing inside of rather than just on the edge of, which was in some ways more intimate and in some ways more terrifying than whatever might have happened in the silence. His hands dropped slowly. She stepped back 1 inch, not 2. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Yes," she said. The word came out softer than she intended. She picked up her glass, took a sip, looked at the bar rather than at him, because looking at him right now required a composure she was still in the process of reassembling. When she finally glanced back, he was watching her with that expression she still hadn't found a name for, the one that made her feel like she was being read not for what she presented, but for what she hadn't said yet. The night was far from over, and neither of them made any move to end it. The rain arrived on a Tuesday without apology. By mid-morning, it had settled into the particular kind of steady, grey persistence that Manhattan wore like a second skin in late October. Not dramatic, not violent, just relentlessly present, the kind of rain that soaked through the deliberate and the distracted alike, and reminded the city that weather didn't negotiate with schedules. The East River had turned the color of pewter. The streets reflected headlights in long, wobbling streaks. Even the taxis seemed subdued. April noticed none of it. She was sitting in the back of her car on the way to Brooklyn, her phone face down on the seat beside her, which was not a thing she typically did. Her phone was usually an extension of her hand, a live feed of decisions waiting to be made, problems waiting to be triaged, people waiting for the particular quality of attention that only she could provide. Today it lay face down because the screen kept lighting up with a name she was not ready to engage with, and she had decided, sometime around 8 a.m., while standing at her kitchen window watching the rain collect on the glass, that she was not going to be managed today. Marcus had retained a PR firm. She had learned this through 3 separate channels before 9 a.m., which meant it wasn't accidental and wasn't subtle. It was designed to be known. The narrative being constructed was careful and familiar. A story about a relationship that had simply run its course, told with just enough warmth to seem generous and just enough implication to do its work quietly. His name appeared in 2 online publications by noon, adjacent to hers in the specific way that required no direct claim while making every indirect one. Her publicist had called twice. Her attorney once. Her COO had sent a message that said only call me when you can, which in their shared language meant call me now. April had gotten in the car and given the driver Alexander's address. She found him exactly where she expected. Beneath the Harley, boots visible, the sound of something being carefully adjusted filling the garage alongside the low percussion of rain on the metal roof. There was a quality to the garage in weather like this, she had come to realize. The rain made the space feel more interior, more insulated from the particular frequency of the city outside. Like a room within a room. She sat on her stool without announcing herself. He would have heard the car, heard her steps on the concrete, heard the particular rhythm of her presence. She had noticed over the weeks that he was someone who registered the details of a room without making a performance of it. He didn't come out from under the motorcycle immediately. He let her settle first, which was, she understood, its own form of consideration. When he finally slid out and stood, wiping his hands, he looked at her face for exactly as long as it took to understand the general shape of what was happening. He didn't ask. He turned to the small office, came back with 2 mugs of coffee, set one beside her on the workbench, and returned to the Harley. He kept working. The silence lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Not an uncomfortable silence. Not the silence of someone waiting for her to speak, or someone carefully constructing the right question. Just the silence of someone who had decided that presence was sufficient and that she would find the words when she found them. The rain intensified briefly against the roof, then settled again. Marcus hired a PR firm, she said. Alexander's hands didn't stop moving. I know. I saw the pieces this morning. April looked at him. You follow the financial press? I follow things that involve people I pay attention to. He said it simply, without drama. What's the narrative? Amicable, mutual, his version of history dressed in the language of civility. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The implication being that I walked away from something good because I couldn't make space for it. And the reality? The question sat in the air between them. April looked at the rain moving down the high garage window in slow, irregular lines. The reality, she said, is that I spent 2 years with a man who was very skilled at making me feel that my perception of things was the variable most likely to be wrong. She paused. Not loudly, not obviously, just consistently. Every disagreement became a question of my interpretation. Every concern became evidence of my difficulty. She stopped, started again. By the end, I was spending more energy auditing my own reactions than running a company. The wrench in Alexander's hand went still. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, he set the tool down on the workbench with a deliberateness that suggested he was choosing his response the way he chose his instruments. Carefully, with an understanding of what the job actually required. He looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't have anyone who stayed," he said. Not a question. Not pity. Something more precise than both. The quiet recognition of someone who had understood not just what she'd said, but what lived beneath it. The specific loneliness of a person who had been surrounded by people and still been profoundly alone in the places that counted. April felt something move in her chest. Not the collapse of a wall. It was never that clean, never that dramatic in real life. More like a seam loosening. A small structural shift that changed the way the whole thing bore weight. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't." Alexander held her gaze for another moment. Then he reached for his coffee, leaned against the workbench a few feet from her stool, and looked out at the rain with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "You deserve better," or any of the phrases that sounded like comfort and functioned like distance. He stayed in the garage, in the rain, in the same room, with a steadiness that made the air feel different, warmer, or perhaps just more honest. Outside, the rain continued its patient, unhurried work, and inside, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time began almost imperceptibly to breathe. The Mandarin Oriental's ballroom had been designed to make people feel significant. It achieved this through the reliable architecture of exclusivity, 30-foot ceilings, chandeliers that caught light and multiplied it into something that felt almost biological, tables dressed in ivory linen with centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The event was the Sinclair Foundation's annual philanthropy gala, which April had chaired for 7 consecutive years, and which had become, over time, less a fundraiser and more a carefully choreographed demonstration of who belonged in the same room as whom. 800 people. Every name on the guest list deliberate, every seating arrangement a quiet argument about proximity and power. April had sent the invitation to Alexander on a Wednesday morning without overthinking it, which was itself unusual. April overthought most things, considered it a professional virtue, and had built a company on the premise that the details other people skipped were exactly where the important information lived. She had typed his name into the invitation system, added his address, and closed the laptop before the second guessing had time to organize itself into a coherent objection. He had responded the same afternoon. One line. "I'll be there." As she had read it twice and then gone back to work, he arrived at 8:14 p.m. April was mid-conversation with a city councilman when she saw Alexander come through the ballroom entrance, and the conversation continued for approximately 30 seconds before she lost the thread of it entirely. He was wearing a dark suit, well cut, clearly new, the kind of purchase made that afternoon by someone who owned one suit and had decided this occasion warranted it. His shirt was white, no tie, the top button open in a way that the room's dress code technically prohibited, and that somehow looked more considered than every pocket square in the vicinity. His hands, the calloused, honest hands that knew how engines worked and what things were actually made of, were the one detail that resisted the setting entirely, and April found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. She excused herself from the councilman. She crossed the room and Alexander saw her coming and watched her the way he always watched her, without performance, without the practiced appreciation she'd learned to identify and discount, just with that quality of attention that still, after weeks, she hadn't fully adapted to receiving. "You came," she said. "You invited me." He looked at her, the midnight blue gown, the understated jewelry, the hair pinned with the precision of someone who understood that elegance was a form of armor. "You look like you own the room." "I funded half of it." "That's not what I meant." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know." She introduced him to no one immediately, which was a choice. The room operated on the logic of strategic introductions, and she wanted one unmanaged hour before the evening became what it inevitably became. They moved through the periphery of the ballroom together, and April watched, with a detachment she was performing rather than feeling, as the room processed Alexander's presence. It was subtle, the way the gala's atmosphere responded to him. A second glance from a hedge fund manager, who couldn't locate him in his mental database of relevant people. A slight recalibration from a socialite, who had perfected the art of assessing a person's net worth from across a table and was visibly uncertain of her results. The quiet confusion of a room that had very clear categories and a person who declined to occupy any of them. Alexander, for his part, appeared entirely untroubled by this. He stopped to speak with one of the Foundation's grant recipients, a woman running an after-school engineering program in the Bronx, and April stood slightly to the side and watched him ask her questions that were specific and genuine and entirely lacking the performative interest that most people in this room deployed like a social instrument. The woman's face changed within 30 seconds of the conversation. She stopped holding her champagne glass like a prop and started talking with her hands. "He's not from the industry," said a voice beside April. She turned. Daniel Hurst, venture capital, old money, the particular brand of Manhattan power that wore itself as casualness. He was watching Alexander with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that was bothering him more than he wanted to admit. "No," April said. "What does he do?" "He builds things," April said, "and fixes them." Daniel processed this. "And you two are here together," April said, with a finality that closed the sentence. She moved back toward Alexander. The evening shifted at 9:40 p.m. when Marcus arrived. She saw him before he saw her. He came in through the east entrance with a woman April didn't recognize and a camera crew from a lifestyle media outlet that had no legitimate reason to be at a philanthropy gala and every reason that had Marcus's fingerprints on it. He was wearing a suit that had been coordinated with the setting in a way that suggested advanced knowledge of the color scheme. He moved through the room like a man following a plan. April felt the familiar cold clarity that came with recognizing an orchestrated move. She also felt immediately adjacent to it, something she hadn't expected, the complete absence of fear. She turned to Alexander. He had already seen Marcus. He was watching April rather than Marcus, and his expression was the calm, geological stillness she had first seen in a restaurant corridor and had been thinking about, in one form or another, ever since. "You all right?" he asked quietly. April looked at Marcus across the ballroom, the camera, the positioning, the calculated entrance that had been designed to find her off balance and on record. She looked at the man beside her, who had shown up in a suit bought that afternoon with his honest hands, and his unhurried presence, and his complete indifference to what this room thought of him. She took Alexander's arm. Not dramatically, not for the camera. Quietly, deliberately, the way you take hold of something you've decided belongs to you, and turned back toward the ballroom with the composed certainty of a woman who had just chosen her direction and had no intention of reconsidering it. Across the room, Marcus's smile thinned by a fraction. The cameras caught none of what mattered. The argument began over dinner, not at the gala. The gala had ended well or well enough, with Marcus departing 40 minutes after arriving, and the camera crew following him out like punctuation on a sentence that hadn't landed. April and Alexander had stayed until 11, and she had watched him navigate the remainder of the evening with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything, speaking when he had something to say and maintaining a comfortable silence when he didn't, which in a room full of people who filled every available silence with the sound of their own importance was, April had decided, its own form of sophistication. They had gone to dinner after, a small Italian place in Carroll Gardens that Alexander knew, and that had no reservation system, and apparently didn't need one, where the owner had seated them at a corner table with the familiarity of someone who understood that Alexander Carter's guests were to be treated as his guests, and that this required no further specification. The food was extraordinary in the way that food prepared by someone who learned the recipes from their grandmother is extraordinary. Not refined, not architectural, just honest and deeply good. The argument began with a question April asked over the second glass of wine. "What happens next?" she said. Alexander looked at her across the candlelit table. "With what?" "With this." She held his gaze steadily. "With whatever this is." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone buying time, but the quiet of someone deciding to say the thing rather than the safer version of it. "What do you want to happen next?" "I asked you first." "You asked me because you already know your answer, and you're testing whether mine matches." April set her glass down. "That's an unfair characterization." "Is it?" The candle between them threw soft, uneven light across the table. Outside, Carroll Gardens was doing what Brooklyn did on Friday nights, living its life audibly without apology, the sound of it pressing gently against the restaurant's fogged windows. "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that you're still using the distance." April went still. "What distance?" "The one you keep between yourself and anything that could actually reach you." He said it without accusation, without the edge of frustration. He said it the way he identified a mechanical problem, not with judgment but with the precision of someone who needed to name the thing correctly before he could do anything useful about it. You show up, you're present, and then at a specific point, right before it gets to somewhere real, you find a way to put glass between yourself and it. That's— She stopped. "I'm not criticizing you for it," he said. "I understand why it exists, but I'm not interested in a version of this where I'm always standing on the other side of the glass, wondering if you're going to let me in or not." The sentence landed with a weight she hadn't braced for. Not because it was unkind, it wasn't, not remotely, but because it was accurate in the specific uncomfortable way that truth is accurate when someone has been paying close enough attention to see past the presentation to the actual structure beneath. April picked up her glass. Set it down again without drinking. "You think I'm afraid," she said. "I think you've been hurt in ways that made fear the most intelligent response available at the time," he said. "And I think you're still running the same protocol, even though the situation has changed." "And you're certain the situation has changed?" "I'm certain about my part of it." He held her gaze. "I can't be certain about yours." The dinner ended shortly after, not badly, not with raised voices or dramatic exits, but with the particular tension of two people who have said true things to each other and need air and distance to process what the truth costs. April paid. He let her, which she appreciated, because the alternative would have been a negotiation neither of them had energy for, and they parted on the sidewalk outside with the careful courtesy of people who cared too much to be careless. She was in the car for 11 minutes before she told the driver to stop. She sat in the stopped car for 47 minutes. Carroll Gardens on a Friday night moved around the parked car with cheerful indifference, a group of people spilling out of a bar across the street, a couple walking a dog that was intensely interested in a fire hydrant, a delivery cyclist cutting through the intersection with practiced efficiency. Normal Friday life, uncomplicated by the specific weight of being a woman who had just been told, gently and without malice, that she was still afraid. She looked up at the building. 3rd floor. The windows were lit, warm, steady, the particular quality of lamplight in a room where someone is awake and not waiting, just present. April thought about Marcus and the 2 years of having her perceptions quietly rearranged until she couldn't trust them. She thought about the 2 a.m. phone call and the stool that had moved 6 inches and the laugh in the cafe that had come out without permission. She thought about a man who had stepped into a corridor for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, and who had never once asked her for anything in return, and who had just told her the most uncomfortable truth anyone had offered her in years with the same steady calm he brought to everything. She thought about the glass. She got out of the car. The building's entrance was unlocked. She took the stairs rather than wait for the elevator, which was less about impatience and more about needing the 3 flights to be doing something with the energy that had nowhere else to go. On the 3rd floor landing, she stopped, took 1 breath, knocked. She heard movement inside. A pause. The door opened. Alexander stood in the doorway in a grey t-shirt and dark jeans, barefoot, his expression doing that unedited thing. Surprise first, then something quieter, something that had clearly been waiting without admitting it was waiting. April looked at him. She had prepared nothing. No speech, no framing, no architecture for the moment. Just herself, in a midnight blue gown on a Brooklyn landing at midnight, having driven away and come back, which was its own kind of sentence. "I'm here," she said. 2 words. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slowly and rested his forehead against hers, and his eyes closed, and the hallway went perfectly quiet, and the world, the board meetings and the press and the glass and the distance and every careful structure she had spent years building between herself and the possibility of being truly known, stopped. Not with noise, not with drama. Just stopped. And in the silence that followed, something entirely new began. The photos appeared on a Thursday morning. April saw them first on her phone at 6:47 a.m., before coffee, before the day had fully assembled itself into its usual forward momentum. She was standing at her bedroom window in the Tribeca penthouse. Grey dawn light over the Hudson, the city still in that brief, merciful state between sleeping and performing, when the notification arrived from her publicist with the subject line that contained no words, just a link. She clicked it. The images were not unflattering, which in some ways made them worse. They had been taken outside Carter's garage over the course of what appeared to be several visits, April arriving with coffee cups, April sitting on the workbench visible through the open roll-up door, April and Alexander standing on the sidewalk outside in conversation, close enough that the body language required no caption. The photographer had been patient and professional and entirely invisible, which told her something about who had funded the exercise. The headline read, "Sinclair CEO's Secret Brooklyn Visits. Who is the mechanic she can't stay away from?" By 7:15 a.m., it had been picked up by 4 outlets. By 9 a.m., 14. April stood in her kitchen and read every piece with the focused clinical attention she brought to hostile acquisition bids, identifying the architecture of the narrative, locating the pressure points, assessing the damage against the actual structure rather than its surface appearance. The tone across the pieces was consistent, not malicious, but bemused, with the specific quality of bemusement that functions as condescension at a lower volume. The word mechanic appeared in 11 of the 14 pieces. Her professional title appeared in all of them. The juxtaposition was the point, and everyone involved knew it. Her phone rang. Board member. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Different board member. She answered this one. The conversation lasted 18 minutes and covered, in the careful language of people who had expensive lawyers and preferred implication to directness, the concepts of perception, brand alignment, and the foundation's stakeholders, which was a way of saying that several significant donors had called that morning, and that April's personal life had created what was being described, with studied neutrality, as a moment of distraction. She ended the call, stood in her kitchen, looked at the river. Then she called Alexander. He answered on the second ring. She could hear the garage in the background, the ambient sounds of a morning already in progress, metal and movement, and the radio playing something low. "I assume you've seen it," she said. "Hour ago." A brief pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." She said it with the automatic precision of someone who had learned to deploy that phrase as both answer and armor. Then, because it was him, "I'm managing it. That's not what I asked." April was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Hudson had gone from grey to silver as the morning light strengthened. A barge moved upriver with the slow certainty of something that had decided on its direction and didn't require validation. "It'll pass," she said. "This is how these things work. 48 hours and something else becomes the story." April. The way he said her name, not urgently, not with the weight of someone about to deliver something difficult, just with a quiet insistence that she stop managing the conversation for one moment and actually be in it, made her close her eyes briefly. "I'm annoyed," she said, "and I'm tired of the fact that the people who are most concerned about perception are the ones who've never had to build anything." "There it is," he said, and she could hear beneath the words something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She drove to Brooklyn at noon. Alexander was where she expected him, at the workbench this time rather than beneath the Harley, working on something mechanical and intricate that required the kind of focused, patient attention that she had come to recognize as his natural mode. He looked up when she came in, assessed her with the quick, accurate read he had developed over months of paying attention, and said nothing, which was the right call. She sat on her stool. She had been there for perhaps 20 minutes, working through emails on her phone with the focused efficiency of someone conducting damage control in real time, when she became aware that Alexander had stopped working. She looked up. He was looking at the workbench. His hands were still, There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not uncertainty exactly, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. A new weight behind the steadiness. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I keep thinking about whether I'm making your life harder." April set her phone down. "Staying," he said. "Whether me staying is something I'm doing for you or something I'm doing because I want to and telling myself it's for you." He held her gaze with the honesty that was simply his default mode, the thing she had come to rely on so completely that its absence, even hypothetically, created a specific kind of dread. "The difference matters to me." April looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing about Alexander Carter that no one who had written mechanic 14 times that morning would ever understand. That the man sitting across from her in an oil-stained garage in Red Hook was running a more rigorous ethical process than anyone in any of her boardrooms, and doing it quietly without audience, because the answer mattered to him regardless of who was watching. She stood up from the stool. She crossed the garage floor, 4 steps unhurried, and stopped in front of him close enough that the conversation had no choice but to be real. "The cost is mine," she said. "I decide what I pay and what it's worth. That's not your variable." He looked at her steadily. "You staying," she said, "is not something that's happening to me. It's something I'm choosing." She held his gaze. "I don't make choices I haven't examined. You know that." Something in his expression shifted, the weight lifting not completely, not immediately, but perceptibly, like a recalibration towards something he could stand on more solidly. His hand reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so quiet and unhurried and natural that it arrived before either of them had time to assign it a meaning. Outside, the city continued its relentless, indifferent machinery. Inside the garage, in the particular quality of silence that existed only between 2 people who had stopped pretending they weren't certain about each other, April felt the last of the morning's weight dissolve into something that had no professional category and required none. But the world outside the garage doors was not finished with them yet. The reservation had been made under her name, not the foundation's name, not the company's name, not any of the institutional identities that April Sinclair had accumulated over 15 years of building something from nothing in a city that respected results and forgot the cost of them. Her name, first and last. For a table for 2 at Celeste Restaurant on a Friday evening in early November, exactly 1 year after a stranger had stepped into a corridor and said 3 words that had rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of her life. She had called the maitre d' herself. Old habit. Her assistant handled reservations as a matter of course, had done so for years. But this one she had wanted to make personally, the way you do certain things yourself, not because you lack the resources to delegate them, but because the act of doing them is part of what makes them real. The evening had started at her penthouse. April was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows in a deep green dress. Not the armor of burgundy, not the composed statement of midnight blue, but something warmer. Something that had taken her longer to choose precisely because it felt more honest when she heard the elevator. She had given Alexander the code 3 weeks ago, in the casual, understated way she had learned to give him things, which was without ceremony, because ceremony created the impression that she was surprised by her own decisions, and she wasn't. Not anymore. The elevator opened. He was wearing a suit she hadn't seen before, charcoal well cut, clearly not purchased that afternoon this time, which meant he had planned ahead, which meant he had thought about tonight with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered to him. White shirt, no tie, the top button open. His hands, she would always notice his hands first, she had accepted this about herself, were clean, the calluses present and permanent and entirely themselves, unchanged by the suit or the occasion or the year. He stopped when he saw her. Not the half-second pause of someone recalibrating. A full stop, the kind that had no performance in it, just an honest response to something that required a moment. "April?" he said. Just her name. But in his voice it had the weight of a complete sentence. "You're on time," she said. "I'm always on time. You were 4 minutes late to the cafe in October. That was a year ago, and you've been saving that. I catalogue useful information." She picked up her coat from the chair. It's professionally necessary. He crossed the penthouse to her, unhurried, the way he moved through every space, as though he had privately decided that rushing was a form of dishonesty about how much time actually mattered. He took her coat and held it for her, and she slipped into it, and his hands rested briefly on her shoulders before dropping away, and the Manhattan skyline glittered through the glass behind them like a city that had agreed, for one evening, to be a backdrop rather than the main event. They took her car to the Upper East Side. The drive was quiet in the way their silences had always been quiet, full rather than empty, the kind of silence that two people only achieve after they have said enough true things to each other that the pauses between words no longer require filling. April looked out at the city moving past the window. Alexander sat beside her with his characteristic stillness, one hand resting on the seat between them, close to hers without touching, which was its own language, and one she had become fluent in. Celeste looked exactly as it always had. The brass plate, the dark wooden door polished, the warm, deliberate lighting inside that made everyone look like they were carrying secrets. The maitre d' who knew her name, who knew both their names now, she realized, because Alexander had been here twice since that first night, and Celeste was the kind of place that remembered. They were shown to a corner table, not the boardroom table, not the private breakdown corner, but something new. A table she had specifically requested that had no history attached to it, a beginning table. The dinner was unhurried. The wine was excellent. They talked about small things and large ones, a project Alexander was considering, a new initiative for the foundation that April had been quietly developing for 2 months, the fact that the Harley was finally, after 8 months of patient reconstruction, complete and running. He had taken it out for the first time last weekend and described the experience with such precise, unguarded joy that April had felt something expand in her chest that she had stopped trying to name, because names made it smaller than it was. They were finishing dessert when April saw Marcus. He was across the room at a large table, corporate dinner by the look of it, mid-conversation and unaware of her presence. He looked well. He looked exactly like himself, polished, positioned, occupying his seat with the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades ensuring that he was always the most significant person in whatever room he was in. April looked at him for a moment with the calm, clear-eyed assessment of someone who had finished processing something and filed it correctly. No cold clarity, no familiar tightening, just recognition and the quiet satisfaction of understanding the distance she had traveled from the woman who had stood in that corridor a year ago, trapped in the narrow space between a memory and a future she hadn't yet decided to want. She looked back at Alexander. He had seen Marcus too. He was watching April rather than Marcus, always her rather than the thing that was supposed to distract from her, with that steady, unhurried attention that had started everything and that she had stopped being unsettled by and started being grateful for in the way you're grateful for things that turn out to be permanent. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over, held his. They settled the bill at 10:15 and walked through the restaurant toward the exit. And April was aware, with the particular, grounded awareness of someone who had spent a year learning the difference between performing certainty and actually having it, of exactly where she was and who she was walking beside, and what it had cost her to get here, and why every part of that cost had been worth paying. In the corridor, the same narrow space between the private dining rooms with its warm light and its particular history, Alexander stopped. He turned to face her, took her face in both hands with the gentleness of someone who understood that some things required care, and looked at her with the expression she had run out of words for long ago, the one that saw her completely and found nothing it wanted to change. "You sure you want to walk in there with me?" he said. Quiet. Almost a question, almost a joke, almost a promise. April looked at him, at the hands that knew how things actually worked, at the eyes that had never once looked at her and calculated an angle, at the man who had stepped into a corridor a year ago for no reason except that it was right and had stayed for every reason that mattered. She smiled, not the interview smile, not the boardroom smile, the one without a rehearsal. "I'm with you," she said. 3 words. His thumbs traced her cheekbones gently. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, slow, certain, the punctuation of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. And when he lifted his head, his eyes were the warmest she had ever seen them. They walked into the restaurant together. The room continued its elegant, murmuring life around them. Glasses caught the candlelight. Conversations ran their careful, polished course. And in the middle of all of it, April Sinclair walked with her hand in Alexander Carter's and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure that she was not moving through a room she had conquered, but living inside a life she had genuinely chosen. The circle had closed, and everything inside it, the corridor, the garage, the cafe, the rain, the rooftop, the phone call at 2 a.m., the stool that moved 6 inches, the laugh that came out without permission, the forehead pressed against hers on a Brooklyn landing at midnight. All of it had been, she understood now, not the story of how she had let someone in, but the story of how she had finally, after everything, let herself stay. She didn't fall in love despite her walls. She fell in love while learning, slowly and without ceremony, that the right person doesn't knock them down. He simply stands on the other side, patient and certain, until you remember that you built the door yourself. What would you be willing to let go of if the right person gave you a reason to finally open it? If this story moved something in you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive.